No matter what you sew, you gotta stop and you gotta start. And that can be just as easy as pressing the foot control or pressing the little green start and stop button. But you can run into some problems, right? Have you ever started to sew and the fabrics got pushed down to the bobbin area and made a knot? No one likes that. That's not fun. Or when you start to sew, you don't know where to place. There's so many things to talk about. I'm on the Brother Stellaire today. It's a pretty fancy machine, but that also means it has a lot of bells and whistles to help us start, stop, and really be effective when we sew. I'm Cathy, and this is Sewing Tech Talk. Let's start to start. Come back. So let's start talking about how the fabric gets sucked down into the bobbin area, because I know that's a universal problem and a complaint for everyone. First of all, let's figure out what's happening. What's basically happening is when you have a machine that does a zigzag like the Stellaire, or most of the machines nowadays, what happens is the opening for the needle to come down is a big wide opening. And it has to be for the needle to make that swing of the stitch. So what happens is if you have the edge of the fabric and it's close to that opening, when the needle comes down, it just pulls that fabric down underneath and it gets jammed and the machine can't advance it and it just gets worse and worse. So let me show you. I have some visual aids. Let's talk about how that happens. So here is my needle opening, and I have a piece of fabric. Here's my piece of netting. We're going to use this just as an exaggerated example. So when it's right there, it's over the opening of the stitch plate, and the needle comes down, and the needle goes through the fabric, and the machine advances the fabric. Well, when the fabric is on the edge, and even with the presser foot down holding it, it can kind of take that fabric and suck it down to the bottom. And the more that goes down to the bottom, well, the fabric just can't advance. So one solution is to have a smaller opening, and that is absolutely possible. So here's my smaller opening, and let's call it a single stitch hole plate. When I have my fabric on the edge and the foot is holding it down, my needle can go through much easier. It's more difficult when I have a denser piece of fabric and I'm on the edge. It's going to take it down. So yeah, it's still going to take it down with this. In that case, I might need a slightly sharper needle. So lesson one, we're going to need a smaller opening. We need a foot that's going to support our fabric, and we might need a smaller, sharper needle. So let's talk about the needle first. When I sew, I like to match my needle to the fabric, and not the fabric, well, the fabric and the thread. So if I have a thinner thread, and I like to use that when I quilt. So here's a thinner thread, it's a 50 weight. I don't need a giant needle to accommodate this thread. I can use a smaller needle like a quilting 75. So what a quilting 75 needle is it's a sharper needle. It also could be a top stitch needle or even a sharp needle, because that needle is going to be sharper. A universal needle has a rounded point, so you can see that if it hits a fiber of the fabric and does that repeatedly, it's going to pull it down. So lesson one, we can take and use a finer needle if we're using a finer thread. And now, what do we need? Well, we need a smaller opening, don't we? So there's a solution that comes with a Stellaire, and it's called a single needle hole plate. Here it is. It comes with the machine, and you can see that the opening right in the middle is just a single opening for that needle to come down, and it supports the fabric so that there's not a big opening to pull the fabric down in through. And what's beautiful on this machine is it's super easy to change it over. We'll do that in just a minute, but now I want to talk about the feet that we're going to use. So the feet that you can use is a foot, if you're doing a straight stitch, to really support that fabric as it comes down. The machine comes with a straight stitch foot, which has a small opening and lots of different places that you can judge where you're going to stitch. And you can get the Ultra T foot, which is nice and solid on the bottom, which means it's going to support that fabric when it's right on top of that single needle hole plate. And it's a nice slick foot. The fabric can really slide on through. So those are a couple options that you can use. This one comes with the machine. This one, well, you're going to use this one quite a bit. So now, let's change this single needle pull plate over. It's pretty simple on this machine. Let me move my visual aids to the side. And we're going to put on this Ultra T foot. So here's the regular foot. Notice how it has that big opening and the big opening down below for that zigzag. Can you see how this does not support the fabric on either end, the top or the bottom? So let's switch it on over. Now, one thing, if you have an older machine, a lot of times you'll have a couple screws that you need to remove to take this needle plate off. No more, my friends. This is a pretty fancy advanced one. But, oh, and if you do have that, what I do is I have a magnetic pin cushion to hold those little short screws because I don't want to drop them down into the land of the bobbin. So now let's take this off. Now I need to turn off the machine because that's what it wants to do, and hopefully you can still see in the dark. So now, here is the multi-purpose screwdriver that comes with the machine. All you do is you insert it in this little hole in the back, push it off to the right, and it pops off. That makes changing your needle plate super fast and super easy. And while we're here, when's the last time you've cleaned out the lint from the bobbin area of your machine? It's really easy, you know, especially with that new pop-off needle plate. So now when the machine turns on, you'll notice that the machine turns on. It has a little hourglass and it comes up to a little picture. What the machine's doing now is it's finding its peripherals. What does that mean? Well, it's finding the foot control you've added, and in this case, it's finding your straight stitch single needle hole plate, which is magic because it won't let you change the needle position and break your needle. There's a special sensor under there the machine knows, and I cannot change the position of my needle, even if I want to. And if there's a stitch I can't do, it tells me I can't do it. So I think that's a super safe feature. So it's easy to switch the needle plate. All you gotta do is turn off and turn on your machine and pop it on. And it's real easy to put on this fun little foot to get stitching. I left it on the other needle plate. Maybe there's a third thing. You have to move your bobbin cover over when you change your needle plate. So here's our Ultra T foot. And when we start sewing, what's going to happen is it's going to really support all the way around that fabric. And I shouldn't have any fabric pulling down to the bottom. Now, what if you don't have a single needle hole plate? Well, you can probably find one for your machine, but you can also try the trick that's called like a leader cloth. And what is that? That means that you can have a spare piece of fabric. In this case, I'm just using some tearaway stabilizer. And you can start to sew on that right before you get to where you're going to sew. What happens is we're going to put this under the entire foot. And that fabric is all supported all the way around, even if I had the other needle plate another foot on. And when I start to sew, I'm going to sew just off. And what that's going to do, it's going to hold that other fabric that I'm bringing in. I'm going to bring in my other fabric, put it right under. Now I can raise and lower the foot with the button, with the knee lever. I can even check my multifunction foot control that comes with the machine, and I can tell it that I can tap the heel or the accessory foot control to raise the needle, lower the foot. I can do all of that kind of stuff. So now when I sew, what's going to happen is that leader cloth is going to support that fabric as it pulls through. So even if I have a dense fabric like a batik, or maybe a finely woven silk, or those fabrics that they just don't want to flow through, or even the delicate little point of a triangle when you're quilting, it's really going to support that and help it go through. Okay, so hopefully we have banished the pokies, the jam ups, we fixed all that. Now there's some other parts about the machine that can make your sewing, starting and stopping, really convenient. And some of them are just on the machine, and some of them you can program, and some of them you can kind of set up in the machine so that whenever you sew, it's automatically going to be your personalized machine. Let's start with some of the basics. So, talking just about a straight stitch, because that's what I have to do. I have that straight stitch needle plate on. If you look at the straight stitch, there's a couple different options. In fact, there's 4 different straight stitch options. The first two, O1 and O2, when you select those, the needle's going to go to the extreme left. I can't pick those because I have this single needle hole plate on. It's not going to work. If you look at 3 and 4, they're both straight stitches as well, but they're in the drop dead center needle position, and that's where I have to be for the single needle hole plate. But let's look a little bit closer. When I look a little bit closer at 103, I don't know if you can see it, so check your machine. At the very top, there's 2 little parallel lines that look like an equal sign put straight up. Now that stitch, O1 and O3, are both that way. In fact, the zigzag 109 is also that way. What does that mean? That means that this stitch is the stitch that when you stitch it and you want to reinforce your stitches. Now reinforcing is extra stitches at the beginning and the end of a stitch, of a seam. Could be a little bit reverse stitching there. That's going to keep your seam from popping open. And on this stitch, 103 or 101, I can go backwards just by pressing this reverse button. It looks like a little U-turn. So if I'm stitching and I press that button, as long as the button's pressed, I'm going backwards. Now, O2 and O4, they're behaving just about the same way when I don't have a special feature initiated. What is that special feature? Well, if you look down here, I have that little U-turn in a button on the screen of the machine. What is that for? Well, that's automatic reinforcement, and I love it. Why? Because, if I'm sewing and I'm a little bit tired, I might forget to reinforce my stitches at the beginning and the end. When I select this, the machine automatically does it. So just by touching that button, the machine is going to do automatic reinforcements at the beginning and the end. And that's where those different stitches really come in. If I have the stitch with the little equal sign at the top, well, it's going to do a little bit of reverse stitching at the beginning and the end, and that's going to reinforce my seam. If I select stitch 2 and 4 that just have the little dot at the beginning, well, that just does some stitching in place, and that might be my preferred method for reinforcing that seam for my project. If I select the scissors also, I am quite the little princess. That means it's going to reinforce the beginning, reinforce the end, and then automatically trim the thread when I have finished sewing. Now, how does the machine know I've finished sewing? Well, basically, once I have that initiated, it's going to do the reinforcement at the beginning, and I can stop and start. But the machine doesn't know I've reached the end of my seam. How do I do that? I just touch this little button up here. Looks familiar, right? So if I touch this button, then it's going to go back and forth at the very end if I have that icon with a little equal sign at the very beginning. If I touch this button, well, it's going to do some reinforcement. Got it? Now I know that sounds kind of complicated, I don't want it to be. Basically, all it has to be is I want my stitches to be reversed. I want just stitches in place. You know the buttons to select. Now, I've written a handout for this in all of my videos. And I want to tell you a little secret about this one. This is the owner's manual for the machine. It's pretty thick. Now, everything I just told you is on this page. You see that? That is quite the little chart, my friend, and it's written by probably a technical writer talking to an engineer. And I like engineers. We have several in the family, but you know, they have a different way of expressing themselves. So what I did is I went through the handout. When I wrote the handout, I went through that owner's manual and I tried to distill everything so it's in simple terms that even I can remember. So check the handout, go to moresew.com/shop. Go to the bottom of that page, look for Sewing Tech Talk with Cathy. When you click that, you'll find all of my handouts. And I tried to make it real simple with lots of pretty pictures. So you can decide on how you want to reinforce your seams for your project. Pretty easy. Remember, it can always be as simple as pressing this button or this button, but I like automatic reinforcement. Let me show you what that looks like. So let's see, we have this one selected, the stitch in the middle. Remember, that's the one where I have to be. I'm going to take the fabric. In this case, I'm just sewing on some stabilizer. Oop, let's hit the scissors. Let's go into the middle of my piece of stabilizer using some dark thread so that you can see it. Now I have to select. I want it to reinforce, and let's ask it to clip the threads at the very end because we want all of the good stuff. So when I start to sew by pressing the power pedal, it reinforces, it stitches. Now I'm going to stop sewing. The machine, I haven't told it that I've come to the end of my seam because I might be adjusting, I might be answering the phone, I might be doing a lot of stuff. I need to tell it when I've come to the end. And I do that by pressing the button that matches the button that I pressed. This is how that works. Pretty slick, huh? You can see the reinforcement at the beginning and the reinforcement at the end. Now, it did reverse. If I wanted it to do that single, just sewing in place, it's really the same procedure. And I've just selected a slightly different stitch. It did the small stitches at the beginning and the reverse at the end. I could have changed that and used the reinforce button and just got some basic stitches of stitching in place at the end. So it's pretty simple to set up your machine to reinforce your stitches automatically. And you don't really have to think about it. And if you're sewing, you know, kind of late at night, the machine's going to remember for you. Now, let's talk a tiny little bit about where to start the stitch. Sometimes placement is super important, right? So if I want to start my stitch at a certain place, let's pick a point. Let's see, I have a pin here. Let's pick a point that we want to start. That's where we want to start our stitch. And it's important that we start there for some reason. Now, I have my Ultra T foot on, and it works great with this single needle hole plate. But there's another foot I can use. I can use an open toe foot if I really need to see where I need to start to stitch. Now this is a foot that is optional for the machine. But what happens is I can really kind of see exactly where that dot is. Now there's a problem though. I need to know where that needle's going to come down. And there's a really cool function on your machine that I don't know if you know about, if you have this machine or not. Let's go into the settings and let's do some personalization of this machine. If I go into settings, what I'm going to do is I can see all the different settings that I can adjust. When I change something in settings, it stays that way till I change it back, even if I turn my machine off and on. I want to, I want to go to the next page, and I like my needle to come up in the middle. That's great. This is where I can change the different positions, the different functions of that multifunction foot control. That's great. And I have all kinds of different stuff down here that's pretty exciting. Reinforcement priority, well, I tell you about that in the handout, and it kind of goes into detail what that does. I have auto down, auto up, and press to trim. Those are kind of cool too. What auto down means is, if you notice how I've been putting my foot down by pressing the little button right here, well, you can tell the machine you want to automatically have that foot lower when you start to sew. That's really convenient. You can tell the machine you want the foot to automatically raise when you stop sewing. That's really convenient. And press to trim, that's my favorite. Have you ever tried to push the scissors on your machine and the machine says, lower the presser foot first? Well, now it does it for you. But let me show you the feature I think you probably may not know about. And that is needle position stitch placement. And that, if you are placing a stitch exactly where it needs to be, that is your friend. Let's turn it on. Okay? Now, what happens with this is, okay, when I use my needle up or my needle down, if I push the needle down, what happens is the needle's going to come down and hover just above the fabric. Even better, it's going to lower the feed dog so that I can place the fabric where I need to place it. So let's push that needle down, and you notice how that needle came only part way down. It's closer so I can see exactly where that needle's going to come down. And if I press that again, well, the needle's going to go down. I'm a little bit off, but I can go needle up and needle down, and I can do that. Now there's another thing that's going to really help me too. Let's take that needle back up again. I can use my LED guide light. Here's my LED guide light, and I can place it exactly where it needs to be on that stitch. If I'm using a decorative stitch, I can place it on the edge. I can know pretty much where I need to place the fabric for that particular stitch in relationship to my project. Now let's try this again. So, there's my dot. Now I know it's right in the middle. Can you see that? I'm going to, I'm going to push my needle part way down, my feed dog's lowered, and now I can kind of tell not only am I right spot, I'm pretty darn close. So you can see that you can use this feature when you really need to position something and know exactly where you need to go. Now, speaking of those decorative stitches, I have one more hint to show you where you can start something. Because this machine, it can sew sideways. And that means I can do some pretty wide, big stitches. Let's go find them. Now, I need to take off my single needle hole plate or the machine won't let me access them, right? So let's do that. The procedure is just the opposite of what I did before. I'm going to turn off the machine. Use my screwdriver. Let's find some decorative stitches that are pretty big. Look at all those beautiful decorative stitches. I know that these are the decorative stitches. Now, Let's find out where they start, because you need to know where they start so that you can place them on your fabric when you begin to sew. So for example, this one, that is shown at only 50%. Now I want to see exactly how big it is. So I'm going to touch the image key at the very top of the screen, and that's the exact size of my stitch. Now how do I know where it starts in relationship? Well, on this machine, what you see is what you get. This is the exact size of that stitch. And I can literally measure. I can take my little measuring device, I can put it up against the stitch, and I can see that this stitch starts 3/4 of an inch from the left-hand side. And I know I can measure 3/4 from where I need to place it. And then that's where that stitch is going to start. And I know it's going to hit exactly where I need to be. Now I always use my LED guide light because that helps me sew this stitch straight. I always keep everything parallel to my edge. Let's see if I measured right. So you can see, you can use the machine to find out exactly where you want to stitch. The last thing I want to let you know is you can use these buttons up here, the reverse button and the reinforcement button, when you're doing decorative stitches. If you want to stop sewing a decorative stitch right where you stop, you press this little reverse button. If you want it to complete the stitch pattern, you press the reinforcement. Don't worry, you don't have to remember it. It's all in the handout. And you can always have the machine automatically reinforce as well. It's all in the handout. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned a little bit about starting and stopping. It's a pretty amazing machine, and well, I'm going to send it off to George, and he's going to tell you a lot more about the beautiful Stellaire. It's going to make your sewing better.
Thanks, Cathy. That was an incredible presentation. And so let's go over the special offer we have on the Brother Stellaire series. So we have the XJ2, which is their combination sewing and embroidery, and the XE2, which is dedicated embroidery. They both share the same embroidery features, which is a large 9.5 by 14 inch embroidery area with over 780 built-in embroidery designs, and of them, over 100 of them are Disney. It also has over 30 fonts and large, beautiful monograms. And with the fonts, you can edit in all kinds of arrangements. You can arc, you can array, you can even cut and paste and kern it in some custom ways. Speaking of customization, you can take a design and do an automatic applique around it. And with the matrix copy, you can copy this very quickly to make patches. And if we had the scan and cut, we can actually send it to the scan and cut out those patches, and then embroider them beautifully. An additional advanced technology is a new 2-point laser positioning. I can take something like a name and position it perfectly on a line. I can use it to do multiple hoopings and match them perfectly. I can even use it for edge-to-edge quilting. Now, part of what the Stellaire series offers is a special relationship with the scan and cut. They actually can marry together, so I can send an applique design right from my machine and it will cut it out perfectly for beautiful applique. But better yet, I can send a design from my scan and cut and turn it into embroidery. It also unlocks a new feature where I can choose one of the colors of my design, whether if it's a built-in design, I can choose that and turn it into applique. But let's take that heart that I sent over. I turn it into embroidery. I select the color, and now it's applique. Now let's bring over the third part of the piece. I want to create my own fabric, and I can do that with Print Moda. I took an image of a rose and I arranged it just in a beautiful kaleidoscope of color. And I printed that fabric and placed it on in the Scan and Cut. I took my design I created on the Stellaire from the Scan and Cut, sent it over to the Scan and Cut, cut it out, and I have one complete embroidery design created with that trifecta of creativity. Now the XJ2 also is a sewing machine, and it has a large 11.25 inch opening, beautiful lighting. It has 760 built-in stitches, from quilting stitches to applique to utility. It even has automatic stippling and some beautiful decorative stitches that are very, very wide. It also has an automatic 1/4 inch feature which moves the needle over a 1/4 inch from the foot, and you can use the laser guidance it has on there so you can just do some beautiful piecing. It also has amazing fabric control with an automatic fabric sensor, and this gives you the ability to sense multiple layers like in denim, or if I want to sew on some sheer fabric like this tricot, I can do that beautifully, or even working with elastics. It handles the fabric beautifully. If it's even more extreme, we can add the digital dual feed. This is a belt-driven feed system that gives perfect contact on the fabric. And so you see here with this marine vinyl, there's no slippage. I also can use it with such things as minky, which is hard to sew with, and of course, quilting. For more information on this incredible product, click on the link to see our current special offer. You can email us at customerservice@moores-sew.com or call us at 1-800-865-9664.